There are houses that keep the dead, and then there are houses that create them. That is the only sentence you need to understand what happened in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in the autumn of 1823, if you can stomach the weight of it. And for 3 months, 17 people died in this quiet farming community. 17 funerals, 17 caskets, and every single one passed through the same building, a stone house with green shutters perched at the edge of town like a sentinel, or a trap. The Hartwell Funeral Parlor. To the townsfolk, the Hartwells were angels of mercy. They prepared the dead with reverence, comforted the living with soft words and warm bread. They waived their fees for the poor, hosted grieving families by the fire, and carried the dignity of the dead on their shoulders. In a small community where trust was currency, they were rich beyond measure. But trust can be a noose, and in Millbrook, that noose tightened slowly. On a crisp October morning, a traveling physician, Dr. Samuel Harrison, stepped into their parlor for what was supposed to be a routine inspection. He walked into that house with a clipboard and a smile. He walked out with a truth so dangerous that local officials buried it for nearly a century. The air inside was clean, laced with the sharp tang of embalming fluid and fresh wood. Gleaming tools lined the preparation tables. Coffins stood like sentinels against the walls. It was the picture of order, the kind you don't question. But as Dr. Harrison examined the bodies lying in their care, the illusion cracked. Faint bruises along a widow's throat, too precise to be an accident. Small puncture wounds in the chest of a strong, healthy farmer. White arsenic powder clinging to the mouth of a young mother. These were not the marks of disease or age. These were signatures, and behind every signature, there is a hand. When Dr. Harrison raised his eyes from the bodies, he found the Hartwells watching him, not with the warmth of hosts, but with the cold patience of predators. A family that had spent 2 decades burying the dead, and perhaps far longer deciding who would become one. None. You were never meant to know their story, but now that you've heard the first whisper, you're already in too deep to walk away. The Hartwells were not newcomers to death. They had arrived in Millbrook in 1801, a family of 5 with a skill no one else possessed, the professional care of the dead. Before them, coffins were built by the town carpenter, and bodies were washed and laid out by family hands. Ezekiel Hartwell changed all that. He brought polished tools, knowledge of embalming, and a quiet authority that made people trust him. Death was his trade, and soon it became his power. They bought the stone house with gold coins, an oddity for a family claiming modest means. It had belonged to a landowner who had passed suddenly without illness. No one asked too many questions. No one ever did. The Hartwell parlor became the final stop for nearly every soul in a 15-mile radius. The family learned everything about their clients, their health, their debts, their loneliness. Information flowed freely to them, because grief has no guardrails. Grief. And once you know who is alone and who no one will fight for, you hold the keys to something far more potent than any weapon. By the time Dr. Harrison arrived in 1823, their system was perfect. Martha Hartwell, the matriarch, moved through the town like a mother hen, bringing pies and soups to the sick or to those she could make sick. Her sons, Josiah and Caleb, knew how to end a life in ways that left no trace, or at least no trace most men would see. Rebecca, the youngest, was the quiet observer, spotting weakness at social gatherings and reporting back to the family. And old Thomas Creed, Martha's father, kept his silence. For a time, that morning, as Dr. Harrison's gloved fingers traced the bruises on a widow's throat, he caught it, a flicker of a glance between Ezekiel and Josiah, quick as a blade in the dark. A signal. He was not just examining the dead, he was trespassing in someone else's hunting ground. The basement was worse. Glass jars lined the shelves, each containing organs suspended in yellowed liquid, organs far too fresh to belong to the long dead. Surgical instruments, sharper than any mortician would need, glinted under lantern light. And tucked under burial shrouds, the edge of a leather-bound book, the kind used not to remember the dead, but to study them. In that moment, Dr. Harrison understood. The Hartwells were not servants of death, they were its architects. And the bodies in their care were not unfortunate souls, they were specimens. Dr. Harrison's hand hovered over the journal, the brittle leather smelling faintly of oil and rot. And before he could open it, Caleb stepped forward, his body blocking the light, his voice polite but final. "Family records, sir, not for inspection." It wasn't the words that chilled Harrison, it was Caleb's eyes. Flat, steady, without the faintest tremor of fear. The eyes of someone who knew that even if you discovered the truth, you wouldn't live to tell it. Harrison left the basement with his questions unanswered, but the image of that book, the weight of it, dug itself into his mind like a hooked nail. He returned to the Millbrook Inn, lit a single candle, and began writing his report. But before the ink had dried, the locals began to arrive. They came one by one, each sitting in the chair across from him, as though confessing sins they couldn't carry alone. A farmer's wife whispered about her husband, strong and laughing on Monday, fevered and gone by Friday, buried by the Hartwells before a doctor could be summoned. An old woman spoke of her sister, visited daily by Martha Hartwell, with broth and bread, dead within the week. A shopkeeper mentioned the peculiar way the Hartwells discouraged delays in burial, warning families that decomposition was unseemly and swift interment was a mercy. A pattern began to form. Every unexplained death bore the fingerprints of access, opportunity, and silence. The Hartwells didn't strike at random. They selected elderly without kin, widowers with land, mothers whose children were too young to ask questions. And once the choice was made, death arrived quietly, almost politely. That night, Harrison's mind turned over the possible motives. Money was obvious, gold, land, valuables buried with the dead. But the sheer number of preserved organs, the surgical precision, the notes he'd glimpsed in the journal, these hinted at something else, a fascination. A hunger not for wealth alone, but for mastery over life's final curtain. To study it, to control it. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the shutters. Harrison felt the shift in the air, the subtle sense that he was now part of the Hartwells' awareness. If they suspected he saw too much, his name would simply become another neat entry in that leather book. And somewhere deep in his bones, he knew that book did not just hold records of the dead. It was a manual. Some houses are built for the living, others are built to hide the truth. The Hartwell funeral parlor was both. The next morning, Harrison returned under the guise of finalizing inspection notes. His real purpose was simpler, to find that journal again. But instead, he found something worse. In the basement, behind the rows of jars and preparation tables, there was a section of wall that didn't belong. The stonework was too clean, the mortar too new compared to the rest of the foundation. He tapped it lightly, the hollow echo gave it away. A false wall. Harrison glanced toward the staircase, listening for footsteps before running his fingers along the edges. There, a hairline seam where two stones met. He pressed and the panel shifted inward with a dull scrape. The smell that rolled out was not the scent of embalming chemicals, but the sweet, heavy rot of flesh. Inside was a hidden room, barely lit by a single oil lamp. Wooden shelves lined the walls, each stacked with neat, labeled boxes. Every box bore a name and a date. And at first Harrison thought they were keepsakes of the dead. Then he opened one. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a lock of hair tied with thread and something else. A tooth, still pink at the root. Other boxes held rings, buttons, letters. Intimate fragments stolen from the dead or from the dying. And on the far table lay a row of surgical tools laid out with military precision, each wiped clean, each ready for use. But the true heart of the room was the second journal. Larger than the one he'd glimpsed before, its pages were crammed with diagrams, measurements, and observations in multiple hands. Not just the how of death, but experiments with timing, dosage, and method. The Hartwells were not satisfied with killing, they wanted to perfect it. They studied the body's reaction to fear, pain, and poison. They noted which methods allowed the corpse to pass as a victim of natural causes. They recorded how long a body could be kept presentable after death for public display. Each entry ended the same way, with a cold clinical judgment of either successful or unsuccessful. Harrison realized he was looking at 20 years of murder distilled into science. This was not the work of people who had lost their way. This was generational. A craft honed and passed down like a family trade, and in that moment, Harrison understood something he would never write in his official report. The Hartwells didn't serve the town served them. That evening, as the oil lamps burned low in the Millbrook Inn, a shadow moved across Dr. Harrison's door. 3 soft knocks, too slow for urgency, too deliberate for a stranger. When he opened it, the figure standing there was bent, frail, almost skeletal. Thomas Creed, honest Creed. A doctor, Creed rasped, his eyes scanning the hallway. I need to speak with you. Away from here. They crossed the muddy street to the stable behind the inn, where the old man's posture shifted. The tremor in his hands stilled, his gaze sharpened. You saw enough today to know something is wrong. But you don't understand how deep it goes. Creed's voice dropped, almost conspiratorial. Oh, the Hartwells don't kill for coin. Coin is just the bait. They kill for knowledge. They believe death is the only truth worth mastering, and they pass that mastery on, generation to generation to generation. But there is a ritual. Harrison said nothing, letting the silence pull the rest out of him. When a Hartwell comes of age, Creed continued, they must take a life themselves. Not just kill, but choose. They must study the victim, learn their habits, their weaknesses, their final fears. They must end them in a way that leaves no trace. The act is not the point, it's the control. Once they succeed, they are bound to the family forever. You don't leave after something like that. You belong to it. You belong to it. Harrison's mind returned to Rebecca, the 19-year-old daughter with eyes far too knowing for her age. She had likely already chosen. You think they fear the law? Creed said, almost laughing. They own this town, not through wealth, but through silence. And they've buried every judge's cousin, every preacher's mother, every sheriff's friend. They know where every debt is owed, every sin is hidden. They can ruin anyone who crosses them or make them disappear. Creed leaned closer. I'm telling you this because I'm dying. They've been dosing me for months. It's the only way out. I'm hoping. Maybe you can stop them. But if you try and fail, Doctor, they will make sure your body is laid out in their parlor before the week is out. The wind howled outside, rattling the stable doors. Harrison knew now that this wasn't just a case of uncovering crime. This was stepping into a system, a centuries-old machine of control, corruption, and death hidden in plain sight. And the Hartwells had already noticed him. You need to understand something. Once you've heard a story like this, you are no longer a bystander. If the Hartwells believed for a moment that you knew what Harrison now knew, you would already be on their list. And the terrifying thing, you wouldn't even notice them watching you until it was too late. That night, Harrison didn't sleep. He sat at the small writing desk in his rented room, pen poised over the page, trying to decide whether to write everything down or burn every memory of it from his mind. But the longer he sat there, the more he became aware of the sound, faint, almost imperceptible, of footsteps pacing outside in the corridor, not moving toward his door, just passing by, again and again. When the dawn finally broke, the street below was already alive with townsfolk. Men tipping their hats, women offering polite smiles, children darting between them. But there was something else beneath it all, a rhythm to their movements, as if the entire town moved to a silent metronome only they could hear. Harrison began to see patterns, the way people crossed the street to avoid certain buildings, the way conversations stopped at the mention of the Hartwells, the way every set of eyes seemed to glance toward the funeral parlor at least once. This wasn't just fear. It was conditioning. A psychological lattice woven so tightly into the daily life of Millbrook that no one could pull themselves free. The Hartwells didn't need to threaten people. They'd built an invisible prison where obedience felt like choice. And then came the letter. Slipped under Harrison's door while he stepped away for breakfast. No envelope, just a folded sheet of cream-colored paper, its surface faintly perfumed. Inside, in perfect cursive, only 6 words. We admire your curiosity, Dr. Harrison. No signature, no threat, just acknowledgement. And in that elegant looping script, he recognized the true power of the Hartwells. They didn't have to warn you. They simply let you know they were already inside your life. The letter was an invitation or a warning, possibly both. But one thing was certain. From this moment on, Harrison was no longer investigating the Hartwells. He was playing their game, and the rules were written long before he arrived in Millbrook. That afternoon, a young man appeared at Harrison's door, well-dressed, carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with black ribbon. His smile was warm, practiced, almost rehearsed. From the family, he said, and before Harrison could respond, the man tipped his hat and vanished into the bustle of the street. Inside the parcel lay a suit, black wool, expertly tailored, and a small brass pin in the shape of an hourglass. No note, this time, but Harrison didn't need one. The weight of the gesture was clear. He had been given a role to play. Whether he accepted or not was irrelevant. In Millbrook, the Hartwells decided who you were. That evening he wore the suit. Not out of respect, but out of necessity. The tailor had altered it perfectly to his frame, as if they'd measured him without his knowing. At exactly 7, a carriage arrived outside the inn, its driver silent, its windows curtained. Harrison climbed in. The moment the door shut, the world outside seemed to fade. The only sound was the slow, deliberate clop of hooves on cobblestone. The carriage stopped in front of a building he hadn't seen before, a grand hall lit by a dozen oil lamps, its facade lined with shadowed figures in fine dress. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke and low conversation. Every face turned toward him as he entered, not with curiosity, but with appraisal. At the center of the room sat a long mahogany table, and at its head, a man Harrison instantly recognized from whispered description alone, Elias Hartwell. His silver hair was slicked back, his suit immaculate, his expression unreadable. "A Dr. Harrison," Elias said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "We've heard much about you. Millbrook has ways of welcoming those who might serve it well. But before we discuss such matters, you must answer a question." The room fell silent. "In your work," Elias continued, "have you found that truth is best revealed, or best concealed?" The question was a trap. Harrison knew it. If he answered that truth should be revealed, he marked himself as a threat. If he said it should be concealed, he accepted their creed. Every eye in the room was fixed on him, waiting to see which man he would become. And then Elias smiled faintly, as if he already knew the answer Harrison would give, because perhaps in Millbrook, the Hartwells always knew. Harrison's mind raced. Every instinct told him to stay neutral, to deflect, to find an answer that revealed nothing. But in that room, surrounded by men and women whose gazes were as sharp as glass, he understood the real danger: indecision. In Millbrook, hesitation was an answer in itself. He took a slow breath. "The truth," he said, "is like medicine. Given to the wrong patient, at the wrong patient, at the wrong time, it can kill. Given carefully, it can save." A murmur rolled through the room. Approval, perhaps, or something darker. Elias Hartwell's smile deepened, but it was not the smile of a man pleased. It was the smile of someone who had just confirmed a theory. "Spoken like a man who understands responsibility," Elias said, gesturing for Harrison to sit. "And in Millbrook, Doctor, responsibility is a currency. Those who hold it wisely are rewarded. Those who squander it are replaced." The word "are replaced," the word "are replaced" hung in the air like smoke. Harrison sat, feeling the weight of every unspoken rule pressing in around him. For the next hour, the conversation flowed with an ease that unsettled him. They asked about his medical work, his family back home, his views on loyalty, on sacrifice. Every question was framed politely, but Harrison could feel the pattern beneath. This wasn't casual talk. It was assessment. Then came the moment he realized this night was not just a gathering. A woman at the far end of the table, porcelain skin, raven hair, eyes that held no reflection, slid a ledger toward him. "Your name," she said, "and your oath." The page was filled with signatures. Some were bold, others faint and shaky as though written by a trembling hand. And beside each name a single date, the day they had joined, whatever this was. Harrison stared at the empty line waiting for him. His pen hovered above it. Elias leaned forward slightly, voice low but carrying across the room. "A sign, Doctor, in Millbrook, will open its doors to you. Refuse, and those doors will close forever. You may find life here rather difficult without them." It wasn't a request. It was a binding moment. Whether he wrote his name or not, Harrison understood. This was his induction. And walking away might be more dangerous than stepping in. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that whichever choice he made tonight, the Hartwells had already decided what would happen next. Harrison signed. The moment the ink touched the paper, it bled into the page in an unsettling way. Too dark, too thick, almost as if it had been waiting for him. The pen felt heavier in his hand than it should have, and when he set it down, the woman with the porcelain skin closed the ledger in one slow, deliberate motion, as though sealing a pact. "Welcome," she said softly, and the word felt less like an invitation than a sentence. The rest of the evening blurred. Toasts were made, glasses clinked, polite laughter rippled through the smoke-filled room. Harrison played the role expected of him, answering questions, offering measured smiles, all while his mind churned beneath the surface. Every now and then he caught Elias Hartwell watching him, not with suspicion, but with the satisfaction of a man who had acquired exactly what he wanted. When the carriage returned him to the inn, the streets were silent. No lamps burned in the windows. Even the crickets had gone quiet. As Harrison stepped into his room, he found an envelope waiting on the bed. His name was written in the same sharp, angular script he'd seen in the ledger. Inside was a single page. "Your work begins tomorrow. 4 a.m. The manor gates will be open. Do not be late." No signature, no instructions beyond that. But the weight in the message was clear. Lateness would not be forgiven. As he lay in bed, sleep refused to come. The events of the evening replayed in fragments. The gleam of Elias's eyes, the ledger's unnatural darkness, the way every person in that hall seemed to speak in layers, as though their real words lived beneath the surface. And then, sometime past midnight, came the sound. A faint scrape against the window, not the creak of wood or the brush of a branch, but something deliberate, rhythmic, as if someone were tracing the glass with a fingertip. Harrison froze, pulse hammering. Slowly, he turned toward the sound and saw, just for an instant, a pale face outside the glass. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, unbroken skin where features should be, and then it was gone. At 3:45 a.m., Harrison was already awake. Sleep had been a lost cause since the faceless figure at his window. He dressed quickly, hands trembling as he buttoned his coat, the chill of the room clinging to his skin. Outside, the streets of Millbrook were washed in pale moonlight, the cobblestones slick from a thin mist that curled through the air like smoke from an unseen fire. He walked toward the manor, the silence so complete that the sound of his own footsteps felt intrusive. The gates were indeed open, not wide, just enough for one man to slip through. They swung slightly in the wind, the faint metallic groan sounding almost like a sigh. Beyond them, the manor loomed larger than it had in daylight, its many windows unlit except for a single glow in the west wing. Elias Hartwell was waiting in the courtyard, wearing a dark coat that seemed to absorb what little light there was. "A punctual," he said, though his tone carried neither praise nor warmth. "A good. You'll find punctuality is essential here." Without another word, Elias turned and led him inside. They did not go toward the grand halls Harrison had seen the night before. Instead, Elias guided him through narrow corridors, lined with doors that were bolted from the outside. Some bore strange symbols burned into the wood, others had tiny sliding hatches at eye level. From behind one door came the faint sound of shuffling, slow, irregular, as if someone were pacing in the dark. "You will not open these," Elias said without looking back. "You will not speak to those inside, nor will you acknowledge them if they speak to you." Harrison swallowed hard. "Ah, and if they need medical attention, they won't," Elias replied flatly. "And if they do, you will be informed." They descended a spiral staircase that seemed to burrow into the earth itself. The air grew colder, damper, and carried with it a metallic tang that Harrison knew all too well: blood. At the bottom was a heavy iron door. Elias produced a key from a chain around his neck and turned it slowly, the lock's groan echoing in the narrow chamber. The door swung open to reveal a room bathed in dim red light, and in the center was a single operating table. Leather straps hung from its sides, still wet from whatever had been restrained there before. "This," Elias said quietly, "is where your service begins." Harrison's breath caught in his throat. The room smelled of antiseptic, but beneath it lingered something far more primal, the coppery scent of blood and the sour tang of fear. He could feel it, almost taste it, as if the air itself had absorbed centuries of suffering. Elias moved toward a covered shape in the corner. It was the size of a person, draped in a coarse woolen sheet. He didn't speak as he gripped the fabric and pulled it back with a sharp flick. What lay beneath was wrong. It looked like a man, but its proportions were subtly distorted. The limbs just slightly too long, the hands ending in fingers that tapered into nail-like points. Its skin was the sickly gray of candle wax, stretched too tightly over its bones. The chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, each one accompanied by a faint rasping sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You will tend to him," Elias said, as though this were an ordinary patient. "Keep him alive, keep him calm, and above all, keep him here." Harrison stared. "What is he?" Elias's eyes narrowed. "That is not a question you are permitted to ask. The less you know, the better your chances of remaining in good health and in our service." Harrison looked back at the figure. In the dim red light, its eyes opened. They were clouded, unfocused, but there was something behind them. Awareness, recognition, and impossibly, sorrow. The creature's mouth opened as if to speak, but the sound that came out was unlike anything Harrison had heard from human vocal cords. A low, trembling note, almost a hum, that seemed to reverberate inside his skull rather than his ears. He stepped back instinctively. "Do not let him touch you," Elias warned sharply, his tone suddenly laced with urgency. "If he does, it will be too late. Elias handed Harrison a small leather satchel. Inside were surgical tools, rolls of clean linen, and 3 glass vials filled with a clear, viscous liquid that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. "You will administer this when he weakens," Elias said. "1 vial at a time. No more, no less. If you run out, you will not have to worry about what happens next." The iron door slammed shut behind Elias, leaving Harrison alone in the red-lit chamber with the thing on the table. The silence pressed in like a physical weight. 8. Harrison could hear every tiny sound. The slow drip of condensation from the ceiling, the faint creak of the straps as the thing on the table shifted. He tried to steady his breathing, but his heartbeat was loud enough to feel in his throat. He approached cautiously, surgical satchel in hand. The creature's eyes followed him, not with the erratic movement of an animal, but with deliberate, tracking precision. That awareness again, as though it were silently studying him in return. One of its wrists was raw and bruised beneath the leather restraint, the skin split where it had struggled. Harrison's medical instinct overrode his fear for a moment. He unrolled a length of clean linen, dampened it, and began to clean the wound. That's when it happened. The creature's head jerked toward him, and from its throat came a deep, resonant hum, the same sound as before, but louder now, vibrating through the air and into his bones. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation, as if invisible fingers were brushing against the edges of his thoughts. His vision blurred, the room seemed to tilt. In the hum he began to hear words, though they were not spoken aloud. "Help me." Harrison staggered back, dropping the linen. "You can speak?" His voice came out hoarse, unsure. The creature's eyes widened slightly, and for the briefest moment, its expression was undeniably human. But the hum deepened, darkening, and the words that followed were different now. "They lied to you." Harrison's knees weakened. It wasn't the meaning of the words that shook him. It was the way they felt. The voice wasn't entering his ears. It was inside his mind, wrapping itself around his memories, his doubts, twisting them into shapes he didn't recognize. A sharp clatter behind him broke the spell, the sound of the iron door unlocking. Elias stepped back in, his expression unreadable. His gaze flicked from Harrison's pale face to the creature's fixed stare. "You heard him, didn't you?" Elias said quietly. "They all do at first. Consider this your warning." Without waiting for a response, he placed a small silver bell on the table beside Harrison. "If he tries again, ring this. But be certain you want me to come, because once I do, there is no going back for either of you." The door closed again, and Harrison was left with the unsettling certainty that the creature would speak to him again, and next time, he might not want to stop it. The hours passed in a kind of oppressive stillness, broken only by the distant groan of pipes and the steady, labored breathing of the thing on the table. Harrison had tried to occupy himself with small tasks, cleaning his tools, pacing the perimeter of the room, but his attention kept drifting back to it. Elias had not returned. The longer Harrison was alone, the more he felt the weight of the creature's gaze. It didn't blink often, and when it did, it was slow and deliberate, like the closing of a curtain over a window. "You're not human," Harrison whispered without meaning to. The hum came again, softer this time, almost gentle. It slid into his thoughts like a warm current through cold water. "Neither are they." Harrison stiffened. "What do you mean?" "The ones who brought you here, the one who calls himself Elias. He wears a face you trust, but it is not his own." The words weren't just sounds in his mind. They carried images, fleeting but vivid. A figure standing in a circle of red light, removing something from its head like a mask, revealing a blur of shapes and shadows beneath. Harrison gasped and clutched the table for balance. "Stop," he said, but the word felt weak, even to him. "I can show you more. I can tell you what this place really is, but you have to free me." Harrison shook his head, though his grip on the satchel tightened. "If I do, Elias will kill you when you are no longer useful. That is what he does." The hum deepened, and this time Harrison felt a tug, not on his body, but on something deeper. Memories began to surface unbidden. Elias finding him at the docks, offering coin for a simple night's work. The uneasy feeling that the man knew more about him than he should. The strange way Elias had looked at him when he asked questions. The creature's eyes glistened, almost pleading now. "You've felt it, haven't you? The way he watches you, the way the others avoid your name." Harrison swallowed hard. He wanted to deny it, to tell himself these thoughts weren't his. But part of him, the part Elias had never touched, knew the creature was right. And somewhere deep in his chest, a dangerous idea began to take root. If Elias wasn't what he claimed, then maybe freeing this thing wasn't betrayal, maybe it was survival. The iron door clanged shut for the night, its echo rolling through the stone hall like the toll of a warning bell. Harrison waited until the sound of Elias's boots faded, each step swallowed by the labyrinth above. He was alone now, alone with it. The air seemed thicker in the creature's presence. Harrison swore it was warmer near the table, as though some hidden heat radiated from beneath its strange, mottled skin. The flickering oil lamp threw shadows across its face, if you could call it a face, and in certain angles it almost looked human. "Oh, you want proof," the voice murmured inside his head. It was no longer the deep, resonant hum of before. This time it was intimate, almost conspiratorial. "Look beneath the floorboards, third plank from the far wall." Harrison hesitated, glancing toward the indicated spot. The plank in question was darker than the others, warped slightly at the edges. His pulse quickened as he crossed the room. Kneeling, he pried at the wood until it lifted with a reluctant groan. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in stiffened cloth. The smell hit him first, copper and rot. He unwrapped it just far enough to see the curve of something pale and soft. Flesh, human. His stomach turned. "What? What is this?" "The others who came before you. The ones who tried to leave. Elias keeps trophies." Harrison jerked the cloth back over the thing, shoving it into the hole as if hiding it could erase what he'd seen. "You could have planted this," he hissed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. He believed it. The creature's hum deepened again, but this time it wasn't meant to lull. It was charged, urgent. "If you stay, you will end up the same. You know this." Harrison turned to face it, his hands clenched. "And if I free you, what happens then?" The creature's eyes gleamed in the lamplight, a strange shifting color that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. "Then I will take you away from here, and I will tell you what Elias fears more than death itself." Harrison's gaze flicked to the silver bell Elias had left on the table. It was so close, within arm's reach, its cold metal catching the flicker of the flame. One ring and Elias would be here in seconds. One decision and Harrison's life could change forever or end before morning. The creature whispered one last time, soft enough to feel like breath against his thoughts. "Choose." Harrison stood in the thick quiet, staring at the bell until his eyes burned. His fingers twitched with the urge to grab it, to call Elias back and end this madness. But something in his chest refused to obey. The memory of that pale, rotting flesh under the plank clung to him like smoke. The creature did not move, did not speak again. It only watched him, patient as the tide, as if it knew that hesitation was the first step toward surrender. "If I do this," Harrison whispered, "and you're lying, then you won't live long enough to regret it." The answer was not meant as a threat, and somehow that made it worse. Harrison's throat tightened. He reached for the satchel Elias had left and pulled out the smallest of the bone-handled blades. The metal felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of every decision made with it. He approached the table slowly, eyes locked on the creature's restraints, thick leather bands fastened to iron brackets, each one worn from years of struggling. Up close, he could see scars around the creature's wrists, places where flesh had grown over the edges of the straps. "You'll have to help me," Harrison said, his voice barely above a breath. "Tell me where to cut." The creature leaned forward as much as the bonds would allow, exposing the seam where leather met metal. Harrison slid the blade in carefully, soaring until the strap gave way with a sound like tearing cloth. One arm free. The creature flexed its hand, fingers too long, joints bending in ways that made Harrison's stomach twist, and then offered the other. Another cut, another strap falling to the floor. Somewhere above them, a floorboard creaked. Harrison froze, knife still in hand. "Finish it," the creature urged, but now its voice carried a sharpness, an edge that hadn't been there before. "Hurry, hurry." Harrison worked faster, slicing through the restraints at its ankles. As the last strap snapped, the creature rose from the table in a single fluid motion. Its height was staggering, taller than any man Harrison had ever seen, and its presence filled the room like a gathering storm. The oil lamp flickered violently. For a heartbeat, the shadows on the wall looked like twisted limbs reaching for him. Then the creature turned its gaze upward, toward the sound above, and smiled. A slow, unnatural stretch of its lips that revealed nothing human at all. What now? Above them, the slow creak of footsteps moved toward the staircase. Each groan of the wood carried the weight of something deliberate, ancient, and in no hurry. The creature moved to the shadows beside the door, its two long fingers curling against the wall. Its head tilted slightly, like a predator catching the last vibrations of prey before the strike. "You said we'd see what he truly is," Harrison whispered. "What does that mean?" "It means," the creature replied without turning its gaze from the door, "you will not be able to unsee it." The iron hinges screamed as the basement door swung open. Elias appeared at the top of the stairs, but it was not the Elias Harrison had seen before. His skin had a faint luminescence, as if lit from within by something smoldering. His pupils were gone, replaced by smooth black voids that swallowed the light around them. Veins pulsed faintly along his neck, dark as ink, branching in patterns too precise to be natural. "A step away from him, Harrison," Elias said. His voice had deepened, a second tone vibrating beneath his words, one that scraped against Harrison's nerves like metal dragged over stone. The creature's gaze flicked to Harrison, its voice now a hiss in his mind. "Do not listen. If you look into those eyes too long, he will own you." Harrison's body trembled. Every instinct screamed to obey Elias, to put down the blade, to step aside, to let the man take control again. It wasn't reason speaking to him, but something heavier, coiled around his will like a chain. "Lie kept you alive when they would have burned you," Elias said, taking a slow step down. "I gave you a place here. And this," he gestured toward the creature, "is what you repay me with. Treachery?" The creature stepped into the dim red light, and for the first time, Elias's expression shifted. Not fear exactly, but something like recognition and hatred. "You should have rotted under the river," Elias said. "You should never have followed me into the water," the creature replied. Aloud this time, its voice deep and resonant, the sound of a door slamming in a cavern. Harrison's mind spun. "You know each other." Neither of them denied it. Elias reached the final step, the shadows behind him stretching unnaturally toward the creature like tendrils. Harrison could see them curling in the air, reaching for its throat. The creature glanced back at Harrison. "If you side with him, you will serve until you forget your own name. If you side with me, you will see the truth." Elias extended his hand. "It's yours, boy." Now, Harrison's breath came in ragged bursts, each inhale burning like smoke. His fingers tightened around the knife, the leather grip slick with sweat. The basement had become unbearably still, as though the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for his decision. Elias stood at the base of the stairs, palms still extended, that inhuman blackness in his eyes pulling at Harrison like a tide. Every part of Harrison's body wanted to step forward, not from trust, but from something deeper, compulsion. He could feel it, an invisible thread looped around his mind, tugging gently toward obedience. "You owe me everything," Elias said, his voice now soft, almost kind. "You were nothing before I found you. I gave you purpose. I can take you beyond the reach of death itself." The creature, still pressed into the shadow, let out a low rumble that rattled the floorboards, and yet it said, "You hide from what you are. You shackle others to your hunger so you can pretend to be more than the thing beneath the river." Harrison's grip trembled. His memories came flooding back. The night Elias had rescued him from the marsh, the strange mark that appeared on his arm after their first meeting, the constant feeling of being watched. None of it had been kindness. It had been ownership. "If you follow him," the creature continued, "your will is gone. Forever. You'll speak with his words, walk with his steps, think with his thoughts, until you aren't you anymore." "And if I follow you?" Harrison asked. "Then you'll see the truth," the creature said, "and the truth will cut you open. But it will be yours." The two figures stared at him, Elias radiating power and control, the creature radiating something far older, colder. Harrison realized there was no safe choice. There was only a choice. He took a step forward. Elias's expression softened, certain of victory, until Harrison stopped, pivoted sharply, and drove the blade downward into the wooden floor between himself and the creature. For the first time, both Elias and the creature looked surprised. The shadows froze mid-reach. The basement seemed to tremble, as if the house itself had not considered this possibility. Then the air shifted again, but this time it wasn't cold, it was alive. The shadows recoiled, the candlelight flaring in sudden defiance. Elias stepped back, his jaw tightening. "A fool," he hissed. "You think you can walk away from both of us? You've already been marked." Harrison glanced at the faint, twisting scar on his arm. The mark pulsed once, and then to everyone's shock, it began to fade. The mark's glow dimmed, fading like the last ember of a dying fire. Harrison stared at it in disbelief. He hadn't done anything, yet it was disappearing as if rejecting the bond itself. Elias's face twisted, the confident mask shattering. "Impossible," he whispered. "You can't break what I've bound." The creature stepped forward from the shadows, and for the first time, Harrison saw it fully. Its form was tall and skeletal, skin like wet stone, but its eyes were human. Not one pair, dozens, all shifting and blinking within the darkness of its face. Each eye seemed to reflect a different moment of Harrison's life, moments he'd never spoken of to anyone. "He has never owned you," the creature said, its voice now calm. "He's only fed on the belief that he did." Harrison felt it then, the subtle truth behind the words. Every time he'd obeyed Elias, every time he'd accepted his commands without question, the bond had tightened. But here, in this moment, standing between them and choosing neither, Harrison had refused the belief at its core, and that refusal was poison to Elias's control. The mark vanished entirely. Elias staggered, clutching his chest as though something vital had been ripped from him. The candlelight flared again, casting him in a harsh, unforgiving glow. "You've made an enemy tonight," Elias spat, retreating toward the stairs, "and you won't live to regret it." His figure dissolved into black mist before the door even opened, the cold rushing out with him. Silence fell. Harrison turned to the creature, uncertain if he'd simply traded one danger for another. "You are free for now," it said, "but freedom is heavier than chains, and you'll find the world far darker than the one you've just escaped." "Then I'll walk it on my own," Harrison replied. His voice was steadier than he felt. The creature's eyes, all of them, blinked once, almost in approval, before it sank back into the shadow beneath the floor. Harrison climbed the stairs alone. Outside, the night was alive with the sound of wind in the trees, but it no longer felt like it was watching him. For the first time in years, he breathed without the weight of someone else's will on his chest. But as he reached the road, a thought struck him, something the creature had said. Free for now. The choice he'd made tonight had ended one chain, but somewhere in the dark, Elias was still out there. And this time, Elias would come for him not as a savior, but as a hunter. Harrison kept walking, his shadow stretching long behind him. The road ahead was empty, but he knew better than to believe he was alone.